If you can do a good trigger pull, you can shoot just about anything. And if you have a terrible trigger pull, you'll always shoot awful. Hi there, and welcome to this episode of the Guns Podcast US. I'm your host, Brent Weed, along with co-host Roy Huntington. We'd like to thank you for joining us here on one of the world's biggest gun talk programs as we talk about all the stuff that we find interesting about the world of shooting. So, howdy, Roy. How's it going today?
You know what? I don't have any complaints, and Susie doesn't listen even if I do, so, what the heck? I know.
Should I cut that part out in the edit?
Yeah, maybe not. Yeah, good idea.
Yeah.
So...
Well, today we're going to talk about a topic that I've done zero research, but yet I've done an entire lifetime of research about, and it's why does your trigger pull suck so badly? And
as I like to say, why are you a jerk?
You're a trigger jerker. But first, before we get to that, though, we got to pay the bills. So here's a quick word from our great sponsor, Tango Down.
Tango Down has been a trusted leader in firearms parts and accessories for more than 2 decades. Whether you're upgrading your everyday carry or finishing out your next rifle build, Tango Down has you covered. Their product line continues to grow with new releases coming in 2026. Visit tangodown.com to explore the full lineup and sign up for email updates so you don't miss what's next. Tango Down, combat gear without peer.
Well, Roy, are you accusing me being a jerk, a trigger jerk?
Yeah, trigger is the key word there, huh?
Exactly.
If someone comes up and says, you're a jerk, right? That would be different if they come up and they say, are you a trigger jerker?
Yeah. And today we're going to talk about something that non-trained people think is completely insignificant, and well-trained people realize it's the entire almost the entire process of shooting wrapped up into one important point. And that, of course, is trigger pull. If you can do a good trigger pull, you can shoot just about anything. And if you have a terrible trigger pull, you'll always shoot awful until you fix that problem. So, Roy, you were a police firearms instructor for a long time. Trigger pull. How important is trigger pull to shooting whatever?
It's like the only most important thing, period. Because you can really have a crappy stance. You could be shooting left weak-handed. You could have a terrible sight picture. But if you have a marvelous trigger press, chances are pretty good you're going to do whatever it is you were trying to do.
Yep.
But if you have the best stance ever seen on Earth, and a sight picture that the gods will be amazed by, and then you jerk the trigger, you're going to miss.
Exactly. And don't you agree that untrained people, it's like, okay, I understand the importance, but let's get down to the good stuff of kicking indoors and jumping and rolling and shooting 7, bad guys. It all starts with trigger pull, and that's why I thought this was such an important topic, because untrained folks just don't seem to get that. And I guess because it's such a physically small part of what you're doing, but it is, as you said, it's only the most important part of whether you're shooting a pistol, a rifle, shotgun, a crew-served weapon. Well, I don't know about that, but anyway, so let's start with, Roy, your philosophy. How do you explain and how do you teach how to pull a trigger?
Well, you don't know what you don't know, right? And new shooters especially don't know that they don't know how to pull the trigger, right? And I think once you tell them that this is important. Many of them will respond positively, and then you can take them through the learning process. But I found the ones that are most challenging are I grew up hunting. My grandfather showed me everything about guns. I already know how to do this. And no, they don't, with very rare exceptions.
I went to basic training in 1972. I spent a whole 8 hours on the range.
Yeah, I'm an NRA certified firearms instructor. So, but this is a timely topic because literally about 2 days ago, there was a young man here. He just bought his first gun, a Glock, in December. I bumped into him somewhere. We started talking about guns. He said, I kind of am struggling because all my shots are going low left all the time, and I just really don't know what to do. And so I said, well, why don't you stop by? I'll be happy to help you with that, and so he was really surprised and appreciative. He knew me a little bit from magazines and videos and stuff. And so he came over, we spent a couple of hours, and it was a classic case of just jerking the trigger, and once I made him understand that the stance you have is fine, right? Your sight picture is fine, but it's how you press the trigger that's causing us problems. And how I illustrated that with him was that I put my back to the target and I said, your job is only to aim the gun. And I put my finger on top of his in the trigger guard. And then I said, let me press the trigger. I said, but you just keep the sights on the target. And so I would press the trigger, and we shot about a 5-round group. And so I turned around, I looked, and it was this really nice little teacup sized group at about 8 yards, when normally his would have been maybe 20 inches, right? And I said, so what did we just learn? My back was to the target, right? You aimed the gun. All I did was press the trigger smoothly, and look what happened. And he just went, holy cow. I had no idea, And I think we need to also talk about something else. There are people who are better at teaching this than I am, definitely. But people say squeeze the trigger. And yes, that's the case. But a lot of people, and I had somebody tell me this, they said, oh, well, when you said squeeze the trigger, I thought you meant squeeze the gun and squeeze it all. Because if you do squeeze, then your whole hand tightens up and stuff like that. And so there needs to be a way of where you isolate the grip from the press of the trigger. And so that's what I've explained to people now. I also stumbled onto something, and I think I stole this from somebody, I said, hold a gun like you would a small bird, so tight enough that it can't fly away, but not so tight that you're going to kill it. Because we've all seen those people that squeeze, they white knuckle them, and pretty soon their hands are shaking and they're scared to death of everything. So, the other thing that I have introduced to people when it's possible with the type of gun they have is a laser. And so I don't personally advocate carrying lasers as a defensive tool, but if you do, that's fine. Just make sure you're training and you understand their limitations, and advantages. But what they're great at is you put that laser on a target, and when you squeeze the trigger, if you have a smooth trigger pull, then the laser just barely dances around, because you can never hold them perfectly still, right? But if you have a jerk, that laser beam dances across the target like it's doing the Macarena out there, right? Yep. And then that's an easy way to practice dry firing in a safe area at home or something, is that you put that laser on the wall and then just keep pressing that trigger until it stays smooth, and that's a huge advantage right there. And somebody did ask me, they said, well, what about those laser snap caps? They make a thing that it's connected to an app, and you can have a screen that's reflective, and you put a laser dummy round in the chamber. You've probably seen those. And so when you pull the trigger, it fires a little shot of laser onto the target. Well, that's fine, but all it does is show you where you happen to be aiming at the time that you pulled the trigger. It doesn't show the laser dancing around. So yeah, invest in a $50 red laser that clamps on the rail of your pistol from Amazon, and practice that way.
Yep. So I suppose we should define this. What if you had to write a definition of a good trigger pull for most guns? What does a good trigger pull look like?
Actually, it's the same for every gun. you know, because ultimately you will always meet what a lot of people call the wall, which is on a semi-auto, it's obvious. You take up the slack and then you reach a point to where now the sear actually starts to move, right? And then that's when the critical moment of the smooth press and follow through occur. If you're shooting a double action revolver, there's a lot of take up, of course, which is, you could consider that to be just the initial part of take up like you would on a single action. But then just before the gun fires, you'll hit a slightly invisible smoother wall, but that's just before the sear releases. And so those two parts of the press are the most critical press. So you can hurry through the beginning. You can take up slack like a son of a gun. You can stage a double action trigger pull until just before it lets off. But then that's the moment of truth. And then that's where everything has to calm down, and that's when everything has to become smooth. When you practice your press, you want to experiment with, if you put too much finger in the trigger, on the trigger, chances are good you're going to pull the gun down and left, for instance. If you don't put enough in, you might pull it in another direction. And so finding a spot on there to where you can press straight back, because it's a state of mind more than anything, because your finger's bending in an arc, so you can't really press straight back. But if you imagine that, press straight back. That's the goal there. The other thing while we're talking about that is, and this young man who was here the other day, he tended to ride the reset, which means in his semi-auto, he would let the trigger forward until it just barely reset, and then, because he said to a YouTube channel or somebody told him that, that way you don't have to do the take up, right? And you can shoot faster and more accurately. Well, except the only thing was sometimes his gun wouldn't go off because he didn't let it fully reset. And so I had to teach him to actually get your finger come off the trigger even. So it resets fully. But trigger press, that's what it's all about. Sight pictures adequate. I know for a fact you will agree with me on this, because we have both pointed guns at bad guys. And in all of the, hundreds of times in our career where we pointed guns at bad guys, I absolutely do not ever remember looking at my sights. I never once aimed through my sights and got a sight picture on a bad guy. I would always index over the top of the sights, because your eyes will not allow you to not look at the threat.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you're looking at the threat and then you force your eyes to look at the sights, they will fight you. And so I think that's proof, though, that the sight picture is secondary to the trigger press, because we've all seen a lot of cops make really good hits. They weren't looking at their sights, but they were pressing the trigger really well. Yeah. So right, what do? Practice.
Practice. I was going to say, and I was going to say, I think one of the biggest problems is, as you kind of alluded to with the guy you were training, is, I need to shoot faster. And I think that's where I've seen this, you can train folks in a decent trigger pull, and then you say, okay, go a little faster. And then it goes to hell, because they think speed means you throw all those fundamentals out and you just start going really fast, and they get back into that whole thing of just snapping their finger back as hard and fast as they can, and creates a whole host of problems. So if you've got to shoot faster, you do the same thing with maybe a little more alacrity, but you don't change anything at all. And I think that's hard for complete beginners to really understand. What do you mean? I can do all that and think about take up, but still do it faster. Well, that comes with, what's that word you came up with, Roy? Practice?
Yeah, practice. Well, it's like, you don't buy a piano and then try to play Tchaikovsky. You learn where the notes are, and you learn how to play chords, and you become smoother, and you become more experienced, and then you can play better, and then you can play faster. And that's exactly the same as shooting. And so when you're a new shooter, you put all of the shooting fast out of your brain. You're months away from that if you're smart. The other thing is, I make every shot count. One of my favorites targets to use are those cheap 8-inch paper plates you buy, like 500 of them in a thing, and they're like $3, right? So I'll tape up. I did with this young man the other day. I tape up 8 or 10 of them on this tall target I have. And I said, okay, now let's stand here. We set up at about 8 yards. I said, I just want you to take one shot on each target. Take your time. And then I walked him through, okay, that's it. Take up the slack. You're at the wall. Now slowly press. Think about what you're doing. Think about the press. Be smooth. Don't hurry. His particular issue was that he had a really good press, and you could even see his trigger finger move, and then they get anxious, and they go, I have to shoot now.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? And then that last little bit, it would go, brr. I actually slow motion videoed him. And it was clearly obvious in the video. You could see nice, smooth, trigger pull. You could see his trigger moving back slowly. And then all of a sudden, right at the break, he hurried it through. But the beauty of these targets like this, where you're putting one bullet on each one, is that your inconsistencies are obvious.
Yeah.
So if you're putting 25 shots in the center of a silhouette, you have no idea where they're going. Yep. Right? They're spread all over the place. So,
and I was going to hit on that, I've been to a lot of training as you have too, Roy, and I've only been to a couple that I felt were a little sketchy. And, the common denominator in those, with those trainers that I didn't feel really did a good job, in my opinion, it was that whole idea. They didn't really talk about trigger press, or its role in marksmanship. They were really focused on speed and getting those rounds down range. And like you said, now you've dumped 3 magazines into a silhouette. Did you learn anything, or you just keep pulling that trigger really fast? And, I contrast that with, say, gun sight. And I think Clint Smith at Thunder Ranch did this too, is, okay, here we are, kids. Everybody's ready. Make ready. One shot, wherever. Okay. One shot wherever. And it's funny because about a third of the class is real impatient. It's like, okay, I can do one shot. I want to do 3 and 5 and mag dump. We're building that fundamental, and it goes back to that, my favorite phrase, slow down, speed racer. It's when you're training, certainly, but when you're training by yourself, and I know Roy does this and I do it, I spend time one slow fire shot at a time, because I'm focused on getting everything set up right. And that will show that glaring error of, oh man, I really, I pulled the trigger, bad trigger pull, whatever my issue was. But you will not diagnose that and fix it if you're just mag dumping all the time. And if your instructor wants you to start out, dump a mag every time and, pairs and triples and all that, I don't know that instructor really knows what they're talking about. But when you go to a class and they start out one single boring shot, that's somebody that understands you gotta build the foundation before you can put the house up.
No, I agree completely. And I think it's very important and very beneficial. I have a little drill that I do. And if someone's new to their semi-auto pistol, is I have them load a magazine with 1 round and then close the slide. And so when we're ready to shoot, they put the magazine in, they run the slide, they get their shooting stance, they use their sights, they press, we see where the bullet goes, the slide locks back. Well, now they have to stop. So they have to drop the magazine. We talk about what happened. Did you think about it? Do you even remember pulling the trigger? What were you thinking about? They load another round, close the slide, put it back in. So that does 2 things. Number one, it slows things down. It gives us a chance to talk about what just happened. And the hidden benefit of this is it gives them manipulation skills and gun handling skills. Right? So they get to practice loading the magazine, putting the magazine in the gun, dropping the slide, locking the slide. It helps them to practice all this kind of stuff. And I think when that young man was here for 2 hours, I don't think we shot 50 rounds total.
Really?
We went very, very slow. And then the other thing we did was I broke out a single shot rifle, and he had never shot a single shot rifle. Actually, I don't think he'd ever shot a rifle before, now that I think about it. And so I had him hitting an 8-inch round gong at 100 yards with this rifle pretty fast. And it was interesting because that's when he really realized how important the trigger press was.
Yep.
Because a rifle, you're good and solid, it's on a rest, you squeeze the trigger. I had him kind of jerk the trigger a couple of times. It became real obvious, So, I don't know. I think if you're new to it, don't be in a hurry. Train methodically and slowly. As you get smoother, you'll get faster. You're not going to become Robbie Latham probably because he's inhuman, but
exactly.
Yeah,
and he does it wrong according to doctrine, which we won't get into it for this discussion.
It's true. He slaps the trigger like son of a gun.
He slaps the heck out of it, but he can obviously
shoots 50,000. Yeah, he shoots 50,000 rounds a year. I've seen him shoot rings around people when he was using a high point, with an 8-pound trigger pull. So, but I think take your time. Concentrate on that trigger press. Dry firing is your friend. Get a laser so you can see what's happening when you pull the trigger. Another thing I like to do is tell people, imagine that you have a dime balanced on the top of your front sight. And when you press the trigger, you don't want the dime to fall off.
Yeah.
And so keep that in your mind. We actually used to do that on our
I was going to say,
guns.
I'm laughing because, because it was hard to get the dime to even balance on the top of that, Model 19. But you had, now with a Glock, you could stack 3 rolls of quarters up there. They wouldn't move, but it's still a valid drill.
Well, what was interesting, too, with this young man is that at the end of the time, was he said, because I let him shoot a single action, which had a crisp trigger pull. And he said, so this trigger pull on my Glock isn't very good, huh?
Learning has occurred, Grasshopper.
Yeah. And I said, no, it's not. I said, but you can still shoot it.
Yeah.
Because I shot it and he saw it could shoot little groups. I said, but it takes practice. And so he wants me to install a new trigger in his Glock now.
Well, that's a good illustration of that fallacy, though. You can put that new trigger and it'll be a better trigger, but unless he knows how to use that trigger, it's not going to do him any good whatsoever. And that goes back to that whole discussion we have of Americans in general, shooters specifically, think if I buy this new whiz bang 5,000 accessory, suddenly I'm Robbie Latham, and that's not how it works. Young Jedi.
We talked about that. Yeah. Because he was saying, well, if I did this, if I did that, if I bought this computer program and I hooked it up to my gun and all, and I said, no. I said, if you were already really good, I said, then a custom trigger will give you another few percent. Yep. If you were already really, really good, then better sights will help you a few percent. I said, but if you're jerking the trigger and you put a better trigger and bigger sights on it, you will still be jerking the trigger, Yep. So you have to overcome all that first, before you make that next step. So, but yeah, get a laser if your gun can hold one. Truly, that is one of the best things. And the other thing, when you're practicing with your semi-auto, either have your friend load your magazine 5 or 6 rounds, but put a dummy round in there. Because it's hard to fool yourself, but but have him do that, or have your wife or somebody, and then when you're shooting, it's really interesting to be going bang, bang, and then you go click.
It's for experienced shooters that should be horribly embarrassing, and I was going to say I've still do that on occasion, not very often. Typically, it's with a new gun, but you get some kind of malfunction, you're testing, and you get okay, here we go. Click. Oh, well, that was embarrassing. Everybody saw that. So.
Yeah, I will say one thing about that, though. I've talked to top competition shooters, and I've seen them do that, right? Except what they're doing is they're anticipating recoil for the recovery. And so when they're shooting, they're so good that as the gun is firing, they're pushing back down against it to recover from recoil faster, or at least that's what they say.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, when you're truly a Zen master, court recognized expert, you can break all the rules and get away with it, just like Robbie Latham. Because I remember we were at Gunsight, and it was a media event. We were talking about trigger pull, and the coaches were working with us. And then Robbie kind of got this little look, and he says, I don't do any of that. It's like, well, I guess I can't argue with the result, because obviously, like you said, he'll shoot rings around anybody. But that's the difference. Here's a guy that's been doing, how many ever rounds per year for decades. Plus, he's superhuman. I'd love to play in the NFL, but I don't have the genetics for it. So I don't need to compare myself to, an NFL player in, 40-yard dash times. I need to compare myself to 63-year-old former magazine editors. So you got to understand that until you reach that level where, you can break the rules and do something different. I don't care what they taught you in basic. I don't care what Papaw taught you. When it comes down to the magic secret of shooting, you get your trigger pull right, and everything else is downhill from there.
I've talked to Larry Michulik over dinner, and because people who shoot revolvers, they want to learn how to shoot double action revolvers fast.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, you don't. You have to learn how to stage it. You have to learn how to shoot slowly, methodically. It will slowly come as you get smoother and smoother. Then you'll be able to shoot faster, and you'll be like Jerry Michulik, right? But Jerry told me he said, my trigger press it's all about the trigger press. And so even if he's shooting 6 shots in 0.2 of a second at a target, guess what? He's still pressing the trigger smoothly.
Yeah.
And it just is the way it is. If you're watching this, if you jump on our YouTube channel, do a search for shooting small frame revolvers, or shooting revolvers accurately, that kind of stuff. I've got a kind of a longish video on how to shoot small frame revolvers accurately, and we talk about sight picture and staging the trigger, and I actually show you how to do that. And it's interesting because there's hundreds and hundreds of comments, and I mean, virtually all of them were, I never knew this before. Nobody ever showed me this before. And I tried it at the range, and now I suddenly can shoot my double action revolver accurately. And so it's not anything to be ashamed about. You just need to learn.
Exactly. Well, good stuff. We've revealed the secret of shooting. That would probably be a good alternate title for this video, because it really is the secret of shooting. You master trigger pull, and everything else, like I said, is downhill from there. So reach out if you got questions or comments. Editor at Guns Podcast US, or of course you can leave us a comment if you're watching on YouTube, and we love to hear what folks are thinking about and their experience and the questions you have, and we'll try to help you as much as we can. Roy, we talk about a lot. We're violating the gun writers code because we don't know everything, but we'll at least give you the benefit of our experience and our opinions.
Speak for yourself, by golly.
I know. My goodness. Well, another great episode. And before we go, we need to, as I said, pay the bills. Here's a word from our great sponsor, Tango Down.
Visit tangodown.com to explore the full lineup and sign up for email updates so you don't miss what's next. Tango Down, combat gear without peer.
On behalf of my co-host, Roy Huntington, of course, I am Brent Wheat, the host of the Guns Podcast US. And as we say every episode, now it's time to get out there and get shooting.